Our final speaker for this morning served the Army for over 39 years. He has commanded at every level from company to forces command. He led units in combat in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He most recently served as the commander of UN Command, U.S. Iraq Combined Forces Command, and United States Forces Korea until his retirement in 2021. It is my honor to introduce General Retired Robert B. Abrams. Sir, thank you for joining us this morning at the Maneuver Warfighter Conference.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that kind introduction. And let me start by thanking Major General Pat Donahoe for inviting me to speak at today's session of the Maneuver Conference. I'm a huge believer and proponent and supporter of ManWarCon, as it's known. And unfortunately, I could not be there in person this morning. We had some really, really bad weather here where I live just north of Kansas City. And it would have prevented me from being able to return home tonight. And plus we've got ice warnings and so forth and potential power outages. So I appreciate General Donahoe indulging me by allowing me to do this from home. Just one technical comment. So if there is a audio or video problem, I'm going to blame it on my commo guy. And because I think we've got everything set up just about right. Today I'm gonna give my reflections on my experience in Korea, but I want to stress that I believe, and I hope at the end that you believe, that there are many, many parallels about a potential fight on the Korean Peninsula and other places throughout the Indo-Pacific. This presentation is all unclassified, of course. It's all from open source, as well as some of my own personal reflections and experience in Korea. So go ahead to the next chart. So for the old dogs in the audience, we were all raised. Yeah, go to chart number 2. There you go. The old dogs in the audience, we were all raised on mandatory reading of This Kind of War by T.R. Fehrenbach, and this is this is one of the famous quotes from it. And there are some people who say that this statement made in 1964 is no longer relevant. I disagree. Just in my time in the Army, on active duty, I personally experienced what is commonly referred to as a revolution in military affairs. First in the 70s, largely as a result of the 73 Yom Kippur War, the word on the street that anti-tank guided missiles and precision guided munitions were going to make close quarters combat irrelevant. That we will now, wars in the future will be fought at standoff, and we'll be able to minimize casualties, but there won't be a need for a close combat force. And of course, that's been proven time and time again to not be true. In the 1990s, many of you, the people there in the auditorium, lived through Army digitization, right? We had a digital brigade. Then we had a digital division, and digitization was going to be the silver bullet, right? It was going to solve all of our ills. It was going to dramatically improve command and control. We were able to see everything, know everything, pass that information. It was going to be augmented with GPS guided munitions, standoff munitions, and huge investments were made in all of that. And of course, this is right on the heels, by the way, of Desert Storm. And we sort of lulled ourselves into a sense that somehow we are going to be able to sanitize something that at its root, in my belief, it can never be made clean. Our business of warfighting, this is dirty, dangerous, up close, personal work. If you want to achieve victory, if you want to achieve those political objectives, it's only going to happen, though it's been for thousands of years. You're going to have to put your soldiers in the mud, up close and personal, on the land to secure that terrain to achieve those objectives. Go to the next chart. For those of you who have not been to Korea, these are some photos from 1950 to 1953. And, why am I showing them? The terrain hasn't changed, except for the fact that the Republic of Korea, South Korea, is much more urbanized. And I'm going to show a picture of Seoul here in a minute. But the terrain hasn't changed. And I'm going to talk more about that here in a second. Go to the next chart. Now you should have a picture of Seoul. There you go. I think you missed one. Go back one. There you go. Nope. Must have fallen out. Well, look, so here's what I want you to imagine. Seoul, the capital city of the Republic of Korea, in 1953 was completely decimated. There was probably less than 24 structures left remaining standing. And the city, of course, had been evacuated of all the civilians. It had been fought over, seized by both sides a couple of times each throughout the course of the war. And I mean, it's, you can pull up those photos yourself. Seoul today in 2022. First off, the population of the Republic of Korea is 51 million. Half their population live in the greater Seoul metropolitan area. So when we talk about large urban environments, Seoul is certainly in that category. Seoul is considered and often referred to as the miracle on the Han River. And if you have never been there, it is breathtaking. It is one of the most modern cities on the planet today. Clean skyscrapers, great underground transportation system, great public transportation system, thriving, teeming cultural center for the Korean people. It is unbelievable. And for instance, if you go back 40 years, there was 3 rivers across the Han River. Today, there's 37, right? This is a country and a city that is constantly growing and expanding. The Republic of Korea, 10th from someone who was a longtime aid receiver, is now a aid provider. 10th largest GDP in the world. It is an economic, cultural powerhouse. That is the Republic of Korea today. And if you think about it, I mean, that's all transpired just in the last 68 years. Okay, so you've all had a chance here to study Sun Tzu. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start at a tactical level, move to operational, and then strategic. So go to the next chart. So, and from the tactical level, right, and we all learned this as young officers, or at least we did, pretty simple approach, right? See the enemy, see the terrain, see yourself. So I'm going to follow that construct. So the KPA, the Korea People's Army, a million man active duty. Think about that. 6 million reserves. That's in a country of 25 million people. Okay? It's huge. And, more than half of that active duty force is well within 40 to 50 kilometers of the demilitarized zone. They've got a huge, their ground force, it's got a huge amount of artillery, right? Tube and MRLs. And yes, it is largely 1960s and 1970s technology. The numbers of infantry fighting vehicles and armor and tanks, you can see there, that's all open source. And again, largely old technology. On the short-range ballistic missiles, right? So we ought to have tactical ballistic missiles. So 700 plus Scud variants, right? That's 1970s Soviet technology. The big unknown, of course, in the ballistic missile category are these relatively new systems, the KN-23, KN-24, 25, many of which have been tested again just in January of this year. Many of them had started their initial live fire testing back in 2019. And we believe it's open source, that we believe they're in production. And what people need to understand about these new KN-23, 24, and 25, unlike their Scud counterpart, these are solid fuel systems, not liquid fuel. The Scud is a liquid fueled system that would require to come out of some sort of underground protective facility, spend 20 to 25 minutes fueling, and then they could launch it. And we had banked for many, many years that our ISR and our detection capability would be able to pick up on these systems being fueled, which would enable us to strike them right before they launch their missile. So these new short-range ballistic missiles are a particular concern because they are solid fuel, which means they can come out of an underground facility, erect their launcher, and shoot within a couple of minutes, which is going to significantly reduce our ability to detect or decide, detect, and then deliver. So this is a new challenge for us. Increased range, right? So we've been able to, and it's been published, they can range all of the Republic of Korea and a good chunk of Japan. Their precision has significantly improved, as has their payload, as evidenced by their tests. So this is going to be a significant challenge, and again, we see this in other parts of the Indo-Pacific. The last thing I'll touch on, for those of you who have not been to Korea, and it's well documented, there's somewhere in the range of 900 to 1,000 long-range artillery pieces, 170 millimeter and higher, with MRLs that are positioned in North Korea, but they are positioned to range the Greater Seoul metropolitan area. And they're positioned in such to be able to rain about 25,000 rounds an hour. You can imagine that, into the Greater Seoul metropolitan area. So you can imagine the amount of destruction, civilian casualties, etc., that would occur if war was to break out again and the conflict restarted, when those artillery pieces north of the demilitarized zone were to start opening up. Next chart. Air defense artillery, right? So SA-2s and SA-6s, this is again 70s technology, Soviet based, and that it is a concern. It's not something we can just ignore. But the other thing is they've got literally thousands of S-60s, which is a short-range air defense system, kinetic, and SA-7s, thousands, and they're all over. So, a significant threat to low-flying aircraft, particularly rotary wing. Last 10 years in the Kim Jong-un regime, he sort of shifted the regime's investments. And this was fairly controversial inside North Korea, where the Korea People's Army had, led the way for some 50 years. So he's made major investment in special operations forces, ballistic missiles, as I alluded to earlier, cyber, hardening of his command and control facilities, and his C4I capability. And oh, by the way, he's also fielded some GPS jammers. His Air Force, right, antiquated, 60s and 70s, Russian and Chinese. He's got a small mix of fighters, not very capable. He's got bombers. He's got a lot of small aircraft, AN-2 Colts for insertion for his SOF, and everything in between. But compared to our Air Force, our combined Air Force, ROC U.S. Air Force, on the surface, it seems pretty insignificant, but it is a threat. He's got a Navy right? So, about 800 craft. And I say craft because his Navy is optimized for operating in the littorals in and around the Korean Peninsula. So they're built that way. And he's got quite a few hovercraft, LPCAs, and again, not very modern technology, but very capable. We need to understand when dealing with North Korea that he has, and I use the phrase ultra centralized. It's probably the most centralized command and control system that we can possibly imagine. And certainly in armistice, as we are today, there's only one guy calling the shots. One guy, and that is Kim Jong-un. No one else has freedom of action to be able to make those decisions. He's got a unique structure by which he exerts his command and control. But what I like to explain to people who don't really understand the nuance of that C2 structure is he's got a system of 4 different departments that basically serve as checks and balances on the others. So if one was to lose sight, sort of fall away from the regime, realize that they've got some problems or that they've decided to not support the supreme leader, there's other departments whose purpose is to keep those guys in check. It's very similar to other communist regimes that we've studied, and it's something that certainly should factor into our operational and strategic considerations. It's well known he's got large stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons that have all been weaponized, and of course he's got nuclear weapons. And the exact number is unknown, right? There's a lot of speculation out with think tanks and other people about how many nuclear weapons he has. He's conducted 6 live-fire nuclear weapons tests, and we have every reason to believe that he has figured out how to weaponize them. So, and that, of course, is the big issue on the table. And this is fundamentally why the U.S. government is focused on denuclearization of the North Korean regime. Let's go to the next chart. I want to talk a second about the Korea People Army soldier, because, and again, this is at the tactical level. So, a couple of things, right? It's mandatory service for all North Koreans, men, some women. 12 years mandatory service. 12 years. So, and for a U.S. Army soldier, right? Could you imagine if you had an initial term soldier who was going to be 12 years on their initial term in the same unit, right? So things like crew stabilization and building competence and confidence in squad, platoon tactics, and so forth, they don't have the turmoil that we do. Yes, they have old equipment, but there is something to be said for having 12 years of stability for their soldiers as they come into their units. When they're not training, there's 2 major training periods per year: a summer training cycle and a winter training cycle. What do? They serve as the regime's labor force, and so they do all sorts of things. Building housing areas, helping build military facilities, weapons building facilities, et cetera, et cetera. Training's pretty rudimentary. It's focused on the basics, but understand this: their training is conducted under very, very harsh conditions that they would likely see in the event that conflict restarted on the peninsula. It's estimated by the World Health Organization that somewhere between 60 to 65% of the North Korean population is malnourished by UN standards. So their armed forces is also largely malnourished and diseased. And of course, it's also well known that discipline is maintained throughout their force with beatings, regular beatings, and forced labor camp re-education. And then the last thing, and this is, in my opinion, this is very difficult for Westerners to understand. if you go back to the very beginning of the North Korean regime under Kim Il-sung, this is a people who have been subject to nonstop regime propaganda and what I call programming for 76 years. Programming in the supreme leader is a godlike figure and is omnipotent, knows all, and everyone must obey. And then secondly, that the United States in particular is their enemy, and that there's only one way, and that is the North Korean way, Juche, as they say. That's the only way. And it's difficult, and I say it's difficult for Westerners to understand because we don't live under, we've never even experienced anything close to this intense, systematic propaganda and programming effort by the North Korean regime to gain absolute adherence to what the supreme leader says. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the photos on the right. So there was a defection in the joint security area in Panmunjom in November of 2017, and that's what the four photos are on the right side of the chart. So that's a upper left photo is this young soldier who, by the way, was not a random soldier. He was part of a hand-selected group that served as the security force inside the joint security area. That joint security area has existed since 1953 with the signing of the Armistice Agreement. It's about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. There is no fence line that separates North and South Korea inside the JSA. The military demarcation line that was established in 1953 as part of the Armistice, there's markers only, there is no fence. So once you're inside the joint security area, it's literally open field running. That KPA soldier stole the Jeep-like vehicle and busted through 2 checkpoints, got as close as he could to the military demarcation line, that's a little road into a parking area, and then immediately jumped out and made the dash. And he had about 80 yards to cover to be able to get to the military demarcation line in South Korea. And as soon as he had broken through the checkpoints, they alerted their quick reaction force, who immediately responded to the area. There was somewhere between 8 and 12 soldiers who then tried to stop and then engage and kill this defector. He managed to cover the 80 meters or so. He was shot 5 times, made it to the south side, got to a wall where he was recovered by the United Nations Command Security Battalion forces, largely Korean, and he was dragged to safety and then medevaced and treated at a hospital. The photo at the bottom right, I like to highlight because it's a bit shocking for some of us. Yeah, those are parasites that were taken from his intestines. So when we say they are largely malnourished and diseased, we're not kidding. And again, this was a handpicked guy. This is one of the regime loyalists. And this is the status of his health. But he is physically tough enough to be able to make that dash, get shot 5 times, crawl to safety, and then be recovered. And he is currently living in South Korea. Go to the next chart. So fast forward a little bit. Last year in February of 21, there was another defector. And this one I like to highlight because, and again, it gets to their physical capability of North Koreans. So this guy in February, right, water temps about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and he gets in the water with a somewhere 1950s, 60s technology wetsuit with fins, and he had a padded jacket underneath his wetsuit. He swam in that cold water for about 6 hours, coming down the east coast from North Korea into South Korea, gets on the ground, then walks over rough terrain for about 7 kilometers until he can turn himself in to South Korean authorities. These are tough people. But all of this is to say we should never underestimate our enemy. They are certainly not 10 feet tall, but they will be tough, and they will be resilient, and they will be capable. Next chart. So let me talk a little bit about the terrain. And I describe the Korean Peninsula, it's just inhospitable. The mountains are, there are unbelievable mountains, as you saw in my earlier pictures, very narrow valleys, numerous rivers and streams, and there's rice paddies in the lowlands. It is inhospitable, which for anybody who has studied the Korean War, you know the impact of the terrain on operations on both sides. It's hot and humid in the summer. It's brutally hot and humid in the summer. You know, people ask, you know, how hot can it be? It's Fort Hood hot in the middle of July at Fort Hood when, you know, the ambient temperature is about 94, 95 with 90% humidity and the heat index is well over 110. It is brutal. And then in the winter, it's bitter cold. And I've been in a lot of cold places across the world. And the wind, there's something about the wind coming out of the northwest, coming from China. That wind will flat cut you in half. And, you know, we've seen and read plenty of books about, you know, people's experience in the Korean War. And even with good gear, right, even with our extreme cold weather system, that wind will cut you in half. And it can't be discounted. On the naval side, biggest concern that we have to understand about the environment, the West Sea, right? So that's the waters on the west coast of the peninsula. They are very shallow, right? So, you know, what's the impact of that? Big impact on naval forces, right? Not good for deep draft ships, right? Light craft, okay, and terrible for submarines. Terrible. For the air, people don't understand this. There's significant cloud cover at 5,000 feet, 40% of the year. So unless you have GPS guided munitions, you're going to have a problem. And sure, we have GPS guided munitions, we have JDAMs, but we have a finite number of them. So oftentimes we're going to find ourselves in a prolonged conflict, dropping dumb bombs through cloud cover, very 1953 like. And it is a significant impact on our ability to conduct operations. The next one there, the yellow dust factor, for those that don't know, this is not something that existed back during the Korean War, but it certainly exists today. And the yellow dust factor is a phenomena that largely comes in about March, April timeframe, runs for about 6 months. This is largely pollution coming from China that comes from the northwest and will blanket the Korean Peninsula. And it is toxic. It is so toxic that there are time periods during the year where it is, I distinctly remember in 2019, there was about a week where the parts per million was so high that, you know, we were trying to put it in plain speak for our service members and family members. It was akin to smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day if you went out and conducted anything. And so that is now also part of the environmental concerns. And then lastly, there is a monsoon season. It's real. In 2020, the peninsula was hit by 3 typhoons, fairly significant. had a significant impact on North Korea, destroyed a lot of crops, roads, bridges, etc. And that is certainly part of our environmental concerns today as part of seeing the terrain. Go to the next chart. I talked earlier about dense urban environments. So the Greater Seoul Metropolitan Area, the GISMA as it's referred to, 25 million people, but there are many large cities, in the 800,000 to 2 million range in Korea. And as we see urbanization continue to grow across the peninsula, it is significant. There is a modern road and rail network in South Korea. Conversely, in North Korea, I would classify them as crippled, poor road, terrible rail networks, and so forth. First-class seaports and airfields all over the Republic of Korea, which is fantastic for us. And the last thing I'd share, for anybody who has served there, they know this well, terrain has significant impact on communications everywhere in Korea. Significant impact. Next chart. So now let's take this from a see yourself. So the first thing we got to understand is we have to get there. Okay, it's 7,000 miles from the California coast to the Republic of Korea. That is so huge load on Transcom and SDDC to gather the requisite number of ships and planes to be able to get our force there. And we have to be prepared for that movement. One of the advantages of our rotational unit strategy on the Korean Peninsula is every 9 months, a BCT and Transcom get a full up rehearsal on how that's going to work. But transporting one BCT in and one BCT out is, you're going to have to multiply that by a factor of several to be able to replicate the load that we're going to have should hostilities restart. Most people don't understand this, but most U.S. Army units will likely arrive after D-Day. That's just a reality. And we plan for it. And the message is the theater will be in contact. We have to be ready to conduct contested reception, staging, onward movement, and integration rapidly and efficiently. And it requires units to utilize multiple command and control nodes the length of the peninsula. Now, this is not new to many of us, this idea of establishing multiple C2 nodes, but it's something we have to practice. And there's opportunities for that practicing of these small C2 nodes as part of our combat training center training to be able to get there and organize properly and so forth. But we're talking about on a much larger scale. Onward movement, multimodal, rail, het, bus, train, etc. And then we need to understand, everyone needs to understand that integration will likely be in contact. There will not be a 14-day sanitized sort of right seat, left seat ride with all that structure that goes with it. We're going to integrate forces in contact. And that's not something that we practice very well, although I understand that we're starting to inject this a little bit into our combat training centers. And that's good, because we need to start building the skills and standard operating procedures to be able to conduct integration while in contact with the enemy. And then lastly, I'd say, and this has been a staple since I was a lieutenant, right? Deploy with 14 days supply, and people sort of said, oh, we don't really need to have 14 days supply. You're going to have to trust me. We really mean it. Units must arrive with 14-day supply, and I'll talk about that here a little bit in a second when I talk about operational considerations. Go to the next chart. So seeing yourself, when we talk about mastery level skills that you need to bring to be able to be successful on the Korean Peninsula. First off, you got to be expert in fighting in deep files and conducting passage of lines forward and rearward, day, night, in contact. The terrain requires it. There's no getting around it. This was conducted, this was learned behavior, by the way, during the Korean War. We got better as the war went on, but we lost a lot of blood and treasure as a result of not being highly trained in these skills prior to the war. You've got to fight with joint fires to enable maneuver. It's not the other way around, right? It's not a maneuver plan and then we sprinkle little joint fires on top of it. You have to fight first with joint fires to be able to enable maneuver. And my point there on the chart, a well-trained joint forward observer with a radio is a high-value asset. It will be a difference maker. And I say we have to treat her or him like they are a high-value asset, right? So what do we do with HVAs? We protect them. We put security on them. We ensure that they are safe, secure, in position to be able to deliver what they need to deliver. Just like a Patriot weapon system is a high-value asset. That JFO will be a difference maker. Let me talk a second about offensive tempo. Tempo will be limited by our ability to resupply ourselves over limited and very congested road networks. I talked about the urbanization and the population of South Korea. Not only are there 25 million people in the greater Seoul metropolitan area, there's about 2 million Koreans that live in the contact area. So within 10 kilometers of the demilitarized zone. All of those civilians are going to have to displace. And the Republic of Korea government's they've got a good plan to do this. It's been rehearsed for many, many years. But the fact of the matter is there's a finite number of road systems, and you've got a large number of civilians coming south, while simultaneously you're trying to push forces north, and more importantly, you're trying to get supplies north to resupply units in contact. So our ability to maintain offensive tempo, the LIMFAC is, are we going to be able to resupply them? The terrain, I've already stressed many, many times already, but here's my takeaway. Compartmentalized terrain like this requires initiative. Leaders must take initiative at every level. When they see opportunities, they have to seize them. And they have to have freedom of action to be able to seize those opportunities. And my question to the group here, the audience, is that something that we practice? Empowering small unit leaders to seize initiative and seek opportunities at every level. That's how we take advantage of opportunities, particularly in the Korean scenario. Next, we have to organize for multiple liaison officers to coordinate with ROC forces. The ROC military is an excellent partner. They are modernized, professional, dedicated. But a language barrier still exists today. We have to plan for it. But our formations are not built with multiple liaison officer packages. We're going to have to build them. Go to the next chart. Operational considerations. I don't have time to go into the detail today. You're just going to have to trust me. Theater level command and control is complicated. It's It's really complicated. What we have to understand is the ROC U.S. Combined Forces Command, the theater level commander, answers to both national command authorities, both U.S. and Korean. The CFC commander takes direction, orders, guidance from the bilateral military committee composed of the U.S. and ROC chairman, and the Indo-PACOM commander sits at that as well, but principally between the two chairmen, and then ultimately to the Secretary of Defense, the Minister of National Defense, and the two presidents. And all alliance planning and operations are subject to binational approval. All are subject to binational approval. 13-hour time zone difference between Seoul and Washington. That is a significant impact on alliance decisions, and you can see the time zone difference for U.S. forces decisions between Korea and Indo-PACOM in Hawaii. And what I like to tell people, because it's a complicated theater level C2, unity of effort, much more important than unity of command. In terms of managing crisis, right? This is the problem everywhere, and we're seeing this play out, by the way, in Europe today. We're in a crisis. We're always seeking to de-escalate, while we're simultaneously trying to posture the force. And in my view, in my experience, it's much, much more art than science, because there is no clear calculus as to what is enough posturing of the force that cannot be misunderstood or miscalculated by the enemy, that they would potentially escalate the situation. And a good example of that is ordered departure and non-combatant evacuation operations. It always risks misunderstanding and miscalculation that can lead to actually accelerating the crisis. So these are operational considerations that we'll experience certainly in Korea, and we'll experience in other places in the Indo-Pacific as well. I already mentioned the 2 million Koreans live in the contact area. And then the last one I'll tell you about crisis management is about flexible deterrence and flexible response options. So think through what I said earlier. All plans and operations are subject to binational approval. So when we think in time and space, we always have to factor in, when we're planning and preparing a flexible deterrent option or response option, think about having to get that through binational approval. It is not easy, and it certainly takes time, and that's also part of the art. Next chart. John Antal gave you an excellent presentation on Monday. I hope you paid attention to it. But in the Korean context, North Korea will always have first move advantage. This will not be a case of the ROC and U.S. initiating hostilities and violating the armistice agreement. So they will have first mover advantage. I mentioned this earlier, but if hostilities were to restart, we're going to be in the middle of a very, very tough fight while simultaneously evacuating non-combatants. And it's not just the Korean people that have to be evacuated out of the contact area, as well as some people in the greater Seoul metropolitan area. We've got American citizens, and we've got somewhere in the 600,000 to 700,000 third country nationals that we know of are going to want to be evacuated. So movement control at the theater level through tactical level, that actually is an imperative. It's not something that we really think about. It's not something that we really plan for, except in the Korean context. But I suggest that this needs to be at the forefront of operational planning. And again, it's not about command and control, about who is in command. That's clear. But it's more a function of the supported commands being closely coordinated and synchronized with the supported command. And in the Korean context, the CFC commander is the supported commander, but all of the Republic of Korea government efforts, that's all part of a supporting command that's principally led by the ROC chairman. So that close coordination to be able to do that while simultaneously fighting the war, that's the key to success. Now, for us to be successful, and we've known this for many, many years, it's not new, but we want to present to North Korea multiple dilemmas simultaneously across multiple domains. Not just because it's a great buzzword, but when you do that, that is a huge challenge, an ultimate challenge for someone who's got ultra centralized C2. We can get inside his decision-making process if you do that, because they don't have freedom of action. But that ability, in my view, has to be fueled by agility, flexibility, and seizing initiative at every level. That's how we get inside their decision calculus. And we have to train for that. We have to prepare our leaders for that. Cyber, EW, and information operations will be as important as lethal fires in this campaign. And by the way, I think we're seeing that playing out very well right now in Eastern Europe, for those of you who are tracking that. And I just touch a second on information operations. This is my own personal editorial comment. In my view, over the last 20 years of conflict that we've been participating in, our information operations have been stuck in a 20th century model. We are slow, we are reactive, we're oftentimes defensive. We seldom attempt to seize the initiative in the information domain. For us to be successful on the Korean Peninsula, and I'd say in the Indo-Pacific, we have to change that model, we have to change that mindset. There are operational reach limitations on the Korean Peninsula, fundamentally driven by terrain and shallow waters to be able to provide us, and limited, very limited road networks, particularly in North Korea, will significantly limit our operational reach capability. Theater level responsibility is to rapidly receive and integrate our forces to include non-US, those United Nations sending states, those UN nations who desire to send forces to the Korean Peninsula in support of alliance operations. We have responsibility for all of them, and we've got to be able to do it while the war is on. That is an operational consideration. I've touched briefly on logistics. I'll just say this, and the saying is true. It is not for amateurs on the Korean Peninsula. It's just not, and that will be the LIMFAC. And then the last part for operational considerations is third parties. Korean Peninsula is in a tough neighborhood. There's some big actors, namely Russia and China, that both have interests on the outcome on the Korean Peninsula. And we have to think through, how are we going to deal with third parties? How do we deter them from poking their nose into alliance operations? And if they were to intervene in some way in alliance operations on the peninsula, what do we do about it? And that is all part of our operational considerations. Next chart. Strategic considerations. This is, again, of course, we want to maintain the armistice. Of course, we want diplomacy to work. Of course, we do not want the restart of hostilities. No one wants war on the Korean Peninsula. No one, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the death and destruction and loss of civilian life and loss of key infrastructure, particularly in the Republic of Korea. So we've got to continue to focus on, at the strategic level, how do we enable, how do the military domain, how do we enable diplomacy while preserving military options for national command authorities? And that boils down to ultimately commanders providing their best military advice to both national command authorities. And I like to remind people, our job is not to tell them exactly what we got to present options. So I'm all for that. But we describe what does the potential impacts of that in risk to mission and risk to the force. If hostilities, we were on a road back to hostilities on the Korean Peninsula, we must increase and maintain international support and legitimacy. That's not just a diplomatic or national command authority responsibility. Everybody has a role to play in that, to include the military. I already talked about the information domain. It is, in my opinion, it's our Achilles heel. And if we don't make some drastic changes and change our mindset, we'll always be behind the power curve in the Indo-Pacific. I talked about STRATCOM already. Look, nothing's going to happen until it moves, right? That's the motto of our U.S. Army Transportation Corps. It will be decisive to the outcome on the Korean Peninsula, our ability to execute and conduct strategic lift. And then, of course, there's third-party considerations at the strategic level as well. Next chart. John Antal talked about the disruptors. So let me just talk about a couple of them. First off, North Korea believes in masking. So that number 10,000, I pulled that off a number of open source documents. That's estimated. But they have steadily been digging in and digging underground and protecting themselves for 68 years. And I don't know what the exact number is, but they got a lot of them. They can protect everything. And we're talking about underground facilities, potentially being able to hold, a regimental size force. They can certainly have got plenty of underground facilities for their ballistic missiles and terror weapon systems. Certainly their strategic forces are underground. A lot of their munition storage and so forth is underground. They believe in masking. So, what do we do about it, right? And that's why I think John Antal raises an excellent point, and we can learn from that experience in NK, Nagorno-Karabakh. Drones, loitering munitions, and long-range precision fires. They absolutely could prove decisive overmatch in this terrain with the North Korean mask. And then the last one I'll touch on there is this idea of concept of use of artificial intelligence to move from a kill chain that it's on its best day, it's pretty good, but it's not good enough. We'll need a kill web to enable us to overcome this massive North Korean advantage in masking, right? Because we're going to need to be able to, when a solid fuel system comes out of an underground facility, we need to be able to kill it within a minute or so. That is what we're talking about. And that will only occur with what this concept of artificially intelligent driven kill web. It's the only way. We'll have much faster destruction of that long range artillery that is also, by the way, in hardened sites that come out and fire and then go back in, which will prevent damage to the capital of the Republic of Korea. And it has the potential, I use the term, to paralyze strategic forces. That the strategic forces, the North Korean strategic forces, are the ultimate trump card safety net for the regime. And if they know that they appear for 30 seconds to a minute out on the road to move to a firing position, and they know they're going to get destroyed on the ground, it may have the intended effect of just paralyzing them, and they won't come out at all. But regardless, the takeaway, I think, and it certainly played true a couple of years ago in the caucus, that AI-enabled kill web will be a difference maker. Next chart. So, you're going to hear from the DCG, one of the DCGs for USARPAC, you're going to hear from the USARPAC commander. Here's what I tell them, and they'll be the first ones to tell you. Anywhere in the Indo-Pacific, just like Korea, first thing we do is we got to get there, right? We have to be postured in CONUS, and that stretches from tactical level, right? Unit movement plans, DALs, etc., tip fit data, all loaded, all those plans being prepared to be able to rapidly get to a railhead, move to a port, all the port teams, supercargos, etc., pre-designated, and we've got to have all the equipment ready for, to load the equipment safely and properly, get it on ships, and get it to the Indo-Pacific. First, we have to get there, and that is not a small challenge, and it's certainly not something we can take for granted. If this is being debated today at the highest levels. If you want to control and dominate the air and maritime domains, you're going to have to control land. And it's not land in the European sense. It's not land in the Southwest Asia sense. We're talking about islands. And history is replete, and certainly World War II is replete. General Donahoe could give a 4-hour presentation alone on 8th Army and U.S. Army amphibious operations and airborne operations to do just that during World War II. But if you want to control the other two domains, you're going to have to control land. I think that the next speaker after lunch is going to give you a pitch on China. I'll just say this. The pacing threat, China is modernizing really fast, and those disruptors apply. I'll just let that guy give his pitch. And then you can see there on the chart, I think many of the operational and strategic considerations that I presented for Korea, they apply in the Indo-Pacific. It's a much broader area. And oh, by the way, we have to always keep in mind, I'm sure General Flynn's going to talk about this, we have 5 mutual defense treaty nations in the Indo-Pacific. They're listed there. That will also be part of our calculus, and certainly is a lesson for the rest of the Indo-Pacific. Okay. Next chart. General Donahoe, I've gone over my time, but I'm prepared for any questions.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate your insight and your comments here today. I got a first question from the audience is, you talked about the first mover advantage and the specific disruptors. How do you see the North Korean People's Army adapting specifically its tactics and its approach to fighting us and the modern forces of the ROC? Like, how are they doing it at a tactical level?
Yeah, so I think we'll, from a positive standpoint, we'll see on that first mover advantage a combination of not just ground forces attack, certainly their long-range artillery, particularly focused on the greater Seoul metropolitan area, and then the use of these short-range ballistic missiles, principally, and targeting both, population centers, counter-value targets, as well as counter-military targets. That's probably the biggest change, right? So seize the initiative and then gain advantage in the information space. And they're pretty clever with it. They don't have the same limitations we do, or that we've demonstrated up to this point. And it'll be massive all at one time.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, sir. Second question. With the mega city that is Seoul, stretching from the Han all the way up to the DMZ now with its urban sprawl, how do you recommend that we train for that fight, just based on the sheer scale of it, and how we get ready for that urban fight from the port all the way up to the DMZ?
Yeah. So look, this is great question. The first thing I'll tell you is the Republic of Korea military has primacy for security and conducting operations in the greater Seoul metropolitan area. They've got a big army, somewhere in the 400,000 range, but they have primacy inside the greater Seoul metropolitan area, and they will be in the lead, right? Our role will principally be on the periphery, on the suburbs, etc. When it comes to the greater Seoul metropolitan area. But we are going to have to deal with other cities and other urban terrain, and significant urban terrain. And this is not new. The Army's been looking at this for 10 years, right? Learning how to fight in mega cities. Very, very difficult to replicate in a training environment, right? It's virtually impossible to replicate it. But I think in terms of training, right, it fundamentally will boil down to small unit tactics that have been successful in other urban fights that we actually do have a lot of experience in. We have fought in the city of Baghdad. We have fought in very congested elements and parts of Iraq, right, in Baghdad, in Sadr City, right, 6 by 8 kilometers, 2.5 million people. We have a ton of lessons that we have learned that have been written about the mixture of dismounted and mounted forces, the role of armor, the role of small UAVs, right? Those skill sets. By the way, if you don't like that example, a good example in Mosul, right? Plenty of that where we enabled partner forces to be able to be successful. The key, I think, though, is the big difference between a place like Mosul and Seoul. Mosul was decimated, right? It was flattened. What we must do, in my opinion, is we must do all we can to prevent damage to facilities and CIVCAS if we ever find ourselves in a serious fight in and around the greater Seoul metropolitan area. And we should do that across the Republic of Korea. We have plenty of examples, certainly in Iraq, of where we were successful in doing that. If you don't like the Baghdad example, use some smaller cities. We have examples and we know how to do that. But it's very difficult to replicate in training.
Thank you, sir. Next question, moving off of the Korean Peninsula specifically, we've heard from multiple speakers and yourself, sir, as well this week about the accelerating tempo and lethality of warfare with proliferation of sensors, autonomous vehicles, aircraft, range, AI. What do you see as necessary for the U.S. military to adapt and thrive in this environment?
Well, I think, first off, we and I'll just speak for the Army, right? We have to get deadly serious about our ability to camouflage ourselves. And I'm certain that John Antal walked you through all the spectrums. When I was growing up as a young lieutenant on the East-West German border, we didn't really we only thought about visual camouflage. It's much more sophisticated now. We have to have planning for our electronic signature. We have to have planning for our thermal signature, right? Noise and light discipline, when I was a lieutenant, has taken on an exponential meaning in the last 40 years. It's much more sophisticated now. And I guess the biggest point is everybody has a role to play, from the individual tank, infantry squad, all the way up through theater level. Everybody has a role to play. And so we should go to school on this. There are plenty of ways for us to practice this. And we have to get really serious in our training, right? So that people who have not paid attention, they need to pay that price in training so that they can learn those lessons to prevent it from happening again. It's kind of a simple approach, but this is very complex. And these are challenges that we didn't have 30 years ago, but we certainly have them today. It's not impossible, but it does put a premium on discipline and units now at the tactical level, because if they don't, they will pay the price.
Thank you, sir. We have time for one more question. Finally, sir, Major General Donahoe and Colonel Tremblay wanted me to ask you if your golf game has improved in retirement. They mentioned a number from when they served in Korea with you, something about a 30-stroke handicap that you were working on. So just have any comment on that, sir?
I'll answer it this way. I'll be, I hope, weather permitting, I'll be at Fort Benning in the first week of May for the Sullivan Cup. I would welcome the opportunity to just show the results. And I challenge General Donahoe and Colonel Tremblay on the Fort Benning golf course, and I'll spot them any number of strokes they want. How's that?
Sounds good, sir. Colonel Tremblay's here. He just said he accepts. Sir, thank you again for the time you've taken out of your busy schedule to join us and the insight and sharing your vast experience with us. So we appreciate it from the Commanding General and the CSM. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Okay. Pat, thanks for having me. To all of you, I hope you're enjoying the conference. It's been a great lineup, and thanks for the opportunity.